Do you believe that there is going to be a day where there's going to be a female in the White House as president, and how do you feel about that?
I wouldn't vote for her.
You would or wouldn't?
Would not.
You would not?
No.
Why not?
For many reasons.
Nice.
I've written an article about that in my former magazine. You'll have to find out my reasons there.
Yes.
The magazine is The Objectivist.
Would you not vote for her because she was a woman, even if she were better qualified than any man?
If we had followed that law, I might.
So this is a prequel of sorts to a video I've made about the outcome of a conversation I had with a Member of Parliament on the gendered nature of power in the 21st century. It's largely based on some articles I wrote partly in preparation for that conversation, and given that I subsequently shared them with that particular person, I thought that their content would make for an appropriate scene setter for that particular video. They primarily concern the political landscape at the end of 2016, which, as you may remember, was enough to cause some Western women to take to the streets and inspired a multi-millionaire who described losing her virginity as a career move to don a pussy hat and have a dream about blowing up the White House. I'll be reflecting on girls versus boys, political dichotomies in modern Britain, and as I'm making this in early 2018, I will obviously consider more recent matters. But to begin with, I invite you to cast your mind back to the 9th of November 2016 and the scenes of sadness at a stadium in New York City where one particular person was notable in their absence. Call me a big softy if you must, but I have to confess to experiencing a genuine sense of sadness after witnessing the outpouring of grief from many women around the world in the immediate aftermath of Donald Trump's surprise presidential victory. I don't mean the broader dismay and fear-mongering about what exactly a President Trump might bring, but specifically the shock, disappointment, and genuine heartbreak expressed over the fact that, as a binary collective sex, women had come so close to shattering arguably the highest glass ceiling, only to have victory snatched away at the last possible moment. Personally, I think that the entire process is to a large extent one giant puppet show. But that being the case, why not have a puppet in a trouser suit for a change, if only to prove that the more things change, the more they tend to inevitably stay the same. That said, it was a relatively fleeting moment of sadness for a fan base largely populated by highly intelligent women prepared to justify, forgive, or at least ignore their nasty woman's quite remarkable list of misdemeanors and ills simply because she wasn't a man. They came so close to witnessing their new hope literally standing under an imposing glass ceiling to declare victory, and yet remarkably, when the news turned sour, the women of the hour didn't even have the decency to turn up to personally thank them before turning off the lights. It's in dark times of defeat and disappointment that you often find out who your friends really are, and for me, one of the most defining moments of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign was the way that she chose to end it. Many viewed Trump's victory as the lowest of low points in a year of low points for gender politics. Sophie Walker from the recently formed Women's Equality Party in the United Kingdom even went as far as proposing that a vote for Donald Trump was a vote to say misogyny and racism don't matter, and that equality for one person means taking it away from someone else. Then again, that particular politician has managed to secure less votes at the ballot box than Britain First, and the monster raving loony party is massively in favour of discriminatory quotas. that circumvent democratic processes, and I for one have been less convinced by her quite old-fashioned sexist rhetoric. Personally, I think that the metaphorical binary boys versus girls measurement glass of equal power between the sexes is at the very least as full as it is empty. Clinton may not have got her hands on the nuclear football, but the fact that an extremely unlikable and compromised sociopath won the popular vote by almost 3 million does somewhat undermine her claim that she lost because of good old-fashioned sexism, as does the fact that the majority of white female mothers didn't vote for her. Some people blamed sexism for Clinton's defeat, not Bill or Benghazi or bit-bleached emails and battered Blackberries, or national security violations, or the Clinton Foundation, or pay for play, or the Saudi connections, or the lies, the flip-flopping, or Iraq, or Libya, or Haiti, or Bloodgate, Whitewatergate, Cattlegate, Filegate, Pardongate, Chinagate, or the DNC fix, or the death count, or her political track record over 3 decades, or her establishment credentials, or the prospect of her partner's return to Pennsylvania Avenue, or even the insanely biased media coverage. But sexism. Presumably, some people even genuinely believe that that is why she lost. When Clinton was accused of playing the woman card, she held her hands up and shrugged, "Deal me in." And the fact is that many have gone on record to confirm that they voted for her purely based on the shape of her genitalia. So if the so-called sisterhoods ever finally do take a moment to reflect on the glass half full side of the sexist voter narrative, they might take heart from the possibility that if they can find a remotely credible candidate, the next time it could very well be a landslide. Our American sisters might also take heart from the other half of that famous special relationship, because with the possible exception of the immediate aftermath of the 2015 general election, it's hard to argue that there has been a better time to be a woman in the UK political arena. Particularly given the headlines about Sexminster and women being scared away from public life by faceless men living in their parents' basements. I doubt that everyone will agree with that conclusion. But again, anyone especially vexed about the shape of your elected representative's genitals would do well to consider a glass half full perspective on what's been a turbulent and transformative few years in British politics. For a short period after the 2015 general election, every major British political party was led by a woman, with one significant exception. That exception being the Conservative Party, whose victory at the ballot box had left pundits assuming that 1 out of 3 former members of the exclusive men-only Bullingdon Club would be leading the country at the end of the decade. And yet, just over a year later, David Cameron had fallen on his sword, Boris faltered at the final hurdle, and the last men standing in the unexpected race to number 10 both turned out to be women. One was seen to imply that mothers know best, and that essentially was that. After a grovelling apology the next day, the leadership contest turned into Theresa May's coronation. And while she may very well only be the second in history, her victory also means that over the last 4 decades, 1 out of every 3 UK Prime Ministers has been a woman. Indeed, anyone interested in conducting an equal power audit would have to be more than a little pessimistic to argue against the notion that women in British public life haven't had a lot to cheer about over the last few years. Not only have we witnessed a second female Prime Minister, but in Scotland, her party is led by a woman, as was Labour until she opted to get out of there and become a celebrity instead. And while her successor may very well be a cis white male, the Scottish First Minister and 50% of her cabinet remain positively female. Northern Ireland's First Minister is called Arlene, her equally paid Deputy First Minister is called Michelle, and the Leader of the Opposition in the Welsh Assembly continues to be Leanne. Obviously, the sex change at the top of the Northern Irish table hasn't miraculously changed the way power-hungry people do politics, and consequently, I suppose we could argue that those 2 posts are currently vacant. But even then, it will be Theresa and Karen taking the wheel until they get their act together. the United Kingdom's longest reigning monarch became the entire world's longest running head of state in 2016, in the same year that her namesake, Elizabeth Truss, became the first female Lord Chancellor. Elsewhere, Diane James couldn't quite stay the course as leader of UKIP, but then again, who can? And while Jo Swinson declined the opportunity to lead the Liberal Democrats, Caroline Lucas broke new ground along with her Green Party colleague Jonathan Bartley by agreeing the first leadership job share. And Amber Rudd became the third female Home Secretary in a decade, and the fastest rising politician to a great office of state since the Second World War. Whether it's police, fire or ambulance, the most powerful person in charge of your emergency is currently a woman, as is the person responsible for running the Crown Prosecution Service, who are currently having to review every single rape case after the collapse of a string of trials caused by a culture of withholding vital evidence. And if all of that isn't enough to paint an at least partially positive picture, we still have wise woman Watson flying the flag for feminism on the world stage, and even the BBC's fictional President of the World underwent gender reassignment last Christmas. Assuming we're ignoring the rumour that the world is really run by a backroom board of bankers comprised exclusively of white men, I'll be the first to concede that it's possible that such a positive picture could be an example of the apex fallacy. But unlike the patriarchy, feminists don't believe that such a thing exists. And besides, that argument falls flat when you consider that 1 in 3 MPs are now female, and that this ratio largely, least, holds true for the Cabinet, the Shadow Cabinet, the House of Lords, regional government including London, local government, senior civil servants, and last but possibly soon to be least, UK membership of the European Parliament. The Good Parliament report, which was published in 2016, identified a whole series of positive action recommendations aimed at both increasing the number of women in public life, but also removing movable barriers for existing members with parental responsibilities. And particularly when you consider current education trends, it's hard to imagine the proportion of women in politics going anywhere but up. There is still work to be done, of course, especially if the majority of women and men really think that a 50-50 parliament is a vital benchmark to achieve. But let's be honest, the so-called Women's Equality Party seem destined to remain smugly sitting in the lobby area, chomping on their freshly cherry-picked feminist zealot cake, while the real politicians roll up their sleeves and smooth down their skirts in the members' chamber. So I want to finish in the same place that we started, and I thought about the pros and cons of a self-identifying female leader of the so-called free world. For anyone who didn't recognise the lady from the opening clip, allow me to introduce author, philosopher, and the mother of objectivism, Ayn Rand. Rand was a fascinating character with many interesting ideas. She rejected the Christian concept of original sin and believed that all individuals deserve to be free to make any choices in life they so choose, as long as it didn't involve initiating force against others. She rejected the notion that men are superior to women, or that women should have less freedom than men, and she also thought the women's liberation movement comprised of a bunch of phonies looking for a state handout. If you asked her whether a woman was capable of holding the highest public office in America, and whether she would vote for them, she would have given you two very different answers.
That low? I think you have a very, very
I'll
low
tell you
opinion
why.
of women.
Let me answer this. It is not to a woman's personal interest to rule men. It puts her in a very unhappy position. I don't believe that any good woman would want that position.
So you are essentially against leadership positions for women then?
No. Oh, no. A president is not the only leadership position. There are senators and congressmen and
it's all right for you if they run and be elected?
Oh, certainly, and I vote for them. But, wait a moment, a commander-in-chief of the army, a woman, I think it's unspeakable.
Now, I haven't read Rand's essay, and I'm not certain I would fully agree with her reasoning, which is something to do with hero worship, apparently. But then again, if I could fully get my not particularly pretty little head around her words, then perhaps I would. Either way, I think Rand's observations on the subject of a female president are worth reflecting on, especially if you were one of Hillary Clinton's champions, or if you're personally considering a career in politics, regardless of where you might live or what might lie beneath your trouser suit. Some people seem to believe that the free world would be a better place if its leader was a woman, but I'm not convinced. This may sound naive, but a woman doesn't have to hold the most powerful seat in the land to change it. Whether it's how she uses her vote, or how she holds powerful men to account while she's climbing up the greasy political pole.
We came, we saw, he died.
Personally, I don't think a female president would make one iota of a difference until the system that surrounds her seat has become worthy of her charge. My interpretation of Rand's response may stray slightly from her original intention, but I doubt she'd disagree. I come from a land that's had its fair share of female presidents, and a country where in my entire lifetime the head of state has always worn a skirt, and yet wars still rage, people still freeze to death on our streets, and disabled people are killing themselves as a direct consequence of Her Majesty's government's policies. You don't have to be president to stand tall and make a difference. And why on earth should any American woman aspire to be commander-in-chief unless she believes she can serve her country without resorting to dropping bombs on someone else's babies on a frighteningly regular basis? If women in positions of power are going to make a blind bit of difference to the ways of powerful men while they're waiting for their turn at the top job, they could do worse than set a better example for the men in the chamber and start acting like politicians that are really worth voting for. And with that thought in mind, I'll leave you with a question from the floor of the Irish Parliament on the occasion of the last American president's return to his roots.
Taoiseach, I think it's important to take this opportunity to bring a bit of balance into the discussions around the visit of the US President and his wife, given the almost unprecedented slobbering over them that the nation has been exposed to over the last number of days. And it's really hard to know which is worse, whether it's the outpourings of the Obamas themselves or the sycophantic fawning over them by sections of the media and the political establishment. We've had separate and special news bulletins by the state broadcaster to tell us what Michelle Obama and her daughters had for lunch in Dublin, but very little questioning of the fact that she was having lunch with Mr. Tax Exile himself. We had very little challenging of the fact that she's glad to be home, a country that she's been in less than a week and that her husband has very tenuous links in. And of course, the biggest irony of all, the protestations of Obama himself in his speech to the children in Northern Ireland about peace, when he said, "Those who choose a path of peace, I promise you that the United States of America will support you every step of the way. We will be the wind at your back." Now I ask you, is this person going for the Hypocrite of the Century award? Because we have to call things by their right names. And the reality is that by any serious examination, this man is a war criminal. He has just announced his decision to supply arms to the Syrian opposition, including the jihadists, fueling the destabilisation of that region and continuing to undermine secularism and knock back conditions for women. This is the man who is in essence stalling the Geneva peace talks by trying to broker enhanced leverage for the Syrian opposition by giving them arms, and to hell with the thousands more who lose their lives, or the tens of thousands more who will be displaced as this war goes on. This is the man who has facilitated a 200% increase in the use of drones, which have killed thousands of people, including hundreds of children. And you, Taoiseach, you are the one who's turned a blind eye on these activities. You've talked about the G8 being an opportunity to showcase Ireland. But is it not a reality that you have showcased us as a nation of pimps, prostituting ourselves in return for a pat on the head? To be honest with you, we were really speculating this morning whether you were going to deck the cabinet out in leprechaun hats decorated with a bit of stars and stripes to really mark abject humiliation here. So my question to you, Taoiseach, is as follows. What steps are you going to take to follow in the correct statements and the correct decision of your colleague Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore, who voted against the lifting of the arms embargo in relation to Syria. What steps are you going to take to ensure that no weapons for Syria are going to go through Shannon in breach of our international laws on neutrality? What steps are you going to take to showcase this country not as a lapdog of US imperialism, but as an independent nation with an independent foreign policy which takes a lead in international diplomacy to outlaw the use of drones, the favourite method of extermination of your friend Mr Obama? Done here. I can only take from your non-answer to the question that you were asked is that you're going to take no steps to ensure that those arms will not be sent through Shannon in breach of our neutrality. You said here last week no arms ever came through Shannon. How do you know that, seeing as no investigations take place? The reality is, in 2012, 548 US planes landed in Shannon. How do you know what was on them if you haven't examined them? Your Minister for Transport revealed in a parliamentary question that 239 civilian planes landed in Shannon, where they sought permission because they were carrying munitions of war or dangerous goods on a civilian aircraft. What steps are you going to take to intervene in this situation? And the last point I'll make is that people in this country are very fond of our American brothers and sisters, and I think we stand far more shoulder to shoulder with them by making valid criticisms of their president, who has broken his election promises, rather than just pimping this nation as a tax haven for their corporations. I'm sure the Americans would far prefer if their multinationals paid their taxes at home rather than offshore here, so they could develop their health care, so they wouldn't be wasting money on arms being sent to slaughter people in other countries.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.